Hello! Welcome to Changeling Cast, the podcast dedicated to reading and dissecting urban fantasy, paranormal, and speculative romance series. I'm your host Mara from the YouTube channel Books Like Woe, and this season we are making our way through Nalini Singh's Psy Changeling series. Today, we are talking about the third book in the series, one of the most beloved books in the whole series, Caressed by Ice, and we are also joined by one of my best booktube gal pals, Bethany from Beautifully Bookish. Bethany! Welcome,
Yay.
Bethany! Yay!
Thank you!
Bethany has very graciously agreed to be my guinea pig for hosting somebody else on a podcast, so snaps to Bethany for being willing to put up with my experimentation here.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited. I love this book.
Yeah, so this, is this your favorite in the series?
This is my favorite, yes.
And how far along are you in the series at this point?
That's a great question. I want to say I'm around book 13.
Okay, so you've got a pretty good chunk of the way in.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've hit some of the icons. You've already passed my favorite book, which I know is not your favorite, but it's okay.
But I did like it. I did like it a lot. Not my favorite, but it was a good one.
This is a very solid choice for favorite book in the series, I think so.
I think
you can be forgiven.
Thank you.
Okay, before we get into things fully, just a couple of logistics. So if you get a chance, please do rate and review if you are listening not via YouTube. And I also wanted to mention, I do have a Discord. It's linked in all of my about stuff on my various, social platforms. I have a thread in there for Psy Changeling, and there are some folks who are reading through for the first time. So if you are looking for people to talk about this series with, besides just listening to me, you can go there. So just a heads up there. So before we get into more about this specific book, Bethany, how did you get into this series? What's your relationship with it so far? Is it your favorite series of all time?
I am really enjoying the series, and it's been an interesting thing. I think somebody had actually recommended it to me once when I was standing in a line at BookCon, which is random.
Like a drive-by recommendation?
Yeah, like we were chatting and they were like, oh my goodness, you should read this. And I was like, and at the time I wasn't really into romance, and I was like, that sounds a little out of my comfort zone. And then you and some other people who I follow on BookTube kept talking about it. I was like, okay, I should give this a try. And then I ended up being pretty into the first book and was like, okay, let's keep going. And then Caressed by Ice is the one where I was like, yes, I love this. I'm definitely going to keep reading. And yeah, it's been fun. This is the first time I've done any rereads because I'm not even up to date on the series yet. But I think my favorite thing about the series as a whole is how you get to return to characters and couples that you've seen in past books and catch up with them and see, them have a baby or see them get married or see their dynamics later on. And it's just so cozy. I love that a lot.
It is a weirdly cozy book for how murdery these books are.
Yeah.
Which I think makes sense in terms of Nalini Singh. One of her stated influences is Nora Roberts, and you've now read a Nora Roberts standalone. And I definitely think that there's some parallels there of this is so cozy and yet so stabby.
Yes. It's so strange to think this is such a cozy book with serial killers. Okay.
Yeah. With psychic rape and awful things that happen. And yet,
yep,
so cozy.
Yep.
Well, normally this is where we would do a recap together, but when I was doing the reread, I was like, you know what? There is a ton of plot in this one. Mm-hmm. So rather than subjecting Bethany to us trying to collectively remember what happens, I decided to just record my own recap. So I'm going to insert that right here for your listening pleasure, and we will meet you back after we remind everybody what happened.
Sounds good.
So in the interest of time, we're going to do a less intensive recap than we have done for the last few episodes. There is a lot that happens in this book, and I'm going to try to just give you a refresher for those of you who either haven't read the book at all. I know there are some of you who still enjoy listening to the podcast, so this will give you some orientation to what is happening in this book, or for those of you who haven't done a reread recently, just to give you a reminder of sort of the big ticket items in this particular book. It is pretty plot dense. Really, this is a book that has 3 main kind of action items happening in it. So we have the macro plot that is moving forward, primarily with the Psi Council trying to kind of get their arms around 2 things. One, the issues that they've been having with the Changelings over the last 2 books, because now they've had 2 very prominent cardinal Psi who have dipped out of the Psi net and have created a lot of sort of tension and undermining of their positions of authority. So they're wanting to kind of get back at the Changelings, or at least have some level of kind of not the Changelings not thinking that they're just sort of getting away with whatever. So we have them doing that kind of at a macro level. And then the other macro level plot that's happening with sort of the political machinations is that we find out that the Psi Council is behind / is aware of, I couldn't quite tell from this book, I'm assuming in the subsequent books I'll have my memory refreshed on this, but there is this idea called Protocol 1. And Protocol 1 is similar in terms of sort of where it's at in its development as Silence was for a while in the kind of lead up to it being fully implemented across the Psi-net. But Protocol 1, instead of just removing emotions from individual Psi, would actually create a hive mind within the Psi-net, which, if you'll recall from past books, some outsiders to the Psi-net kind of think that's what it is, but we, as the readers, know that's not really what's happening with the Psi-net. There are still individuals, they just have kind of a lesser degree of freedom of choice and such because they are practicing silence, which means that they don't really have emotions in the same way that they used to. But Protocol 1 is in an experimentation phase. This is the first book where we're having this concept introduced, so I'm not going to go into the full thing around it, but basically we come to understand that there would be levels to the hive mind, so there would be, for lack of a better term, the worker bees, who would be most of the Psi, but then there would also be kind of a queen bee class. And we learn that Ming Laban, who's one of the counselors, fucking Ming Laban, because I hate that guy, he has been overseeing a lot of its kind of day-to-day implementation, but it has been set back because of this other macro plot thing that gets introduced in this book, which is the Ghost. And the Ghost is a rogue in the Psi-net who seems to be anti-council, who is plotting to undermine everything they're trying to do. And the Ghost, through kind of the beginning of the book, he's causing trouble, and through the course of the book, with the help of Judd Lauren, who is our hero in this book, I've not even gotten to the individual main characters in this book yet, but he ends up orchestrating the lab where Protocol 1 is being developed to be destroyed. So the Ghost is this sort of, I don't know, I kind of think of him as like the Scarlet Pimpernel, or, the in V for Vendetta, the guy with the Guy Fawkes mask. Like, he's sort of this rogue, anonymous guy who's making trouble for the government. So we get a lot of Caleb POV in this book. He has become kind of our main council POV. And we see him negotiating and forming an alliance with Nikita Duncan, kind of in opposition to Shoshana and Henry Scott, who we learn at the end of the book were among some of the first people to receive the implants that enforce Protocol 1 as sort of at the queen bee level. And then there were 8 people who were meant to be the worker bees with them. But their plans are definitely like postponed or thwarted through the actions of the Ghost. So that's kind of the like main macro plots that are happening in this. On a micro plot level, we have 2 other components happening. First, our main characters are Brenna Kincaid, who, if you will remember, is the wolf changeling woman who was rescued at the end of Slave to Sensation. She was Enrique's last victim, and she was essentially like mentally raped. We also come to learn she was sexually assaulted, not in kind of a traditional way, but through him using his TK powers, he violated her kind of on every level possible. And she was rescued at the end of Slave Dispensation, and she's been sort of healing, but she definitely is still bearing those scars. And one of the things, like her growth past that horrible thing that happened to her is one of the main arcs of the story, because this is her romance with Judd. Lauren, who's one of the most beloved characters in this entire series. Brenna is such a worthy heroine for him. Anyway, we'll get to that. But he is this one of the Psy who, if you'll recall, is living in the Snow Dancer pack with his brother and his 3 nieces and nephews. And part of what we learn about his backstory is that he was an arrow. And I meant to mention this in the Visions of Heat episode, and I forgot. We get introduced to the concept of arrows in that book, but the arrows are basically an elite military force within the Psy, who are controlled, it's not widely known, and we find out in this book who controls them, and that is Ming Laban. Kind of the way that Enrique was controlling the Netmind, Ming Laban is controlling this elite military force of like uber assassins who are taken as children and like ruthlessly tortured and molded into these very specific like martial wielders of Psy abilities. Judd was among that very elite cadre of soldiers in the Psynet. And part of what we see, like basically one of the microplots is he and Brenna having their romance. And the kind of internal conflicts they're both facing have a lot to do with feeling like their past has impacted them in a way that makes it impossible for them to move forward, much less move forward in some sort of mating bond. And it's really a lot of the stories about them finding inner strength through each other and moving forward together, healing those wounds. One thing that we learn is that Judd has silence that he thinks is necessary to control his specific kind of psychic ability, because he is a TK cell, which is basically he has the ability to like shape people on a cellular level, and pre-silence, pretty much all TK cells ended up accidentally murdering their families. So he thinks he cannot break silence because he will just become utterly like uncontrolled in his violence. So a lot of the story for him, he experiences physical pain when he has touch, because the basically his conditioning in silence, they twisted his innate telekinetic ability to cut his own mind, basically, whenever he broke silence. So whenever he and Brenna try to essentially like take things further on a physical or even sometimes an emotional level, his brain is literally like starting to bleed. So it's very intense. So a lot of it's the emotional journey of them coming together, but it's also the kind of how are they going to be together. In the previous books, we saw for Sasha and Faith, the big sort of barrier for them leaving, or like, kind of the external conflict seemed to be like, how are they going to get out of the Psynet? For Judd, it's how is he going to be able to have an emotional relationship if when he breaks silence, he has a physical, he's physically hurting himself. So the way that is eventually circumvented, and what Brenna helps him kind of come to realize is that he can keep the parts of silence that are sort of the tripwire, so to speak, for him going over the edge into violence, which is something that the TK cells pre-silence didn't have. So he can keep that, but we learn earlier in the book, it's established, he has this intense gifting of how to manipulate different kinds of controls in people's minds. That was a part of his arrow training, and he's able to fix his own silence so that he no longer has that physical reinforcement to emotion. And he does it because his niece, Sienna, is also suffering under having that silence, and it's causing her a lot of discomfort too. So he wants to do it for himself before he teaches her how to disable some of her silence. So that Brenna kind of takes him on that journey. And for Brenna, he is helping her regain her feeling of control over her body and her mind, because that was so violated when Enrique tortured her and did what he did to her. So that is a huge part of their journey. She had lost the ability to shift, and at the very, very end of the book, after their mating bond is in place, when he disassembles his silence, her wolf comes back. They have some very sexy, sexy scenes. Some of the hottest, I think, in the book, just because of the kind of build up to them. This is a very slow burn for their physicality because of the implications of physical touch for Judd. And then I guess the other piece is that he is becoming to be accepted as a part of the pack and as a part of her family, because her brothers, I've mentioned this previously, have this intense possessiveness or intense protectiveness, I guess, really, over her after what happened to her. That's, I mean, sisters in peril is a big theme throughout the Changeling series. So there's this big kind of growth for her of moving away from her brothers and helping set boundaries there, but also them accepting Judd as her partner because they hate the Psy after what happened to her, and they really resent Judd and are very suspicious of him coming into their family and into the pack. But essentially Judd becomes a lieutenant of Hawk's by the end of the book, because Hawk kind of says, hey, I can't have such a dominant person in our pack without them being someplace in the hierarchy, because that throws off our pack dynamics. It creates confusion and it creates a lot of fights. So if you want to stay here with your family and with Brenna, you've got to be in the hierarchy, and you are the equivalent of a lieutenant. We also, getting to the other kind of somewhat micro plot that feeds into the macro plots, Judd and Brenna are helping with sort of two layers of mystery or like suspensiness. One is that Judd, as I mentioned, helps the ghost destroy the lab that was working on Protocol 1. We also meet a character, so we meet the ghost. The ghost, and a character named Father Perez are kind of co-conspirators in trying to sabotage things going on in the Psynet. Father Perez is a part of sort of a reformed version of Catholicism, which I'd forgotten about, but is present in this book. So we see throughout him helping the ghost run interference there. And then the other micro plot are that one of them kind of feeds into the macro, one of them doesn't. There's a murderer on the loose within the Snowdancer pack. At the very beginning of the book, we find a body with Brenna and Judd of a shifter named Timothy, who was murdered in a way that was meant to look like a copycat of what Enrique had been doing. And Brenna had actually seen this happening in her mind before it happened, kind of similar to what we saw in the last book with Faith. And so she thinks, there's somewhat of a suspense of like, did Brenna do it? Maybe did Judd do it? A lot of the pack seems to suspect him, but there's a lot of ongoing kind of sabotage happening in the pack, including an attempt to blow up Judd and Brenna when they are at a cabin, which is it's orchestrated to look like it was the Dark River Leopard pack, but quickly they realize, because Brenna and Judd were there and smelled them, they know it was a hyena pack, and it was made to look like it was the leopards. Quickly they realize this is the Psy trying to kind of pit them against each other, so they're not sure if Timothy's death is a part of that plot or if it's its own thing. So that's kind of part of the big suspense of this book, is figuring out how these different pieces come together. There's also a clan or a pack, I guess, of deer shifters who are slaughtered. It was going to be like a total annihilation of this entire family group, but some Dark River leopards happened to be in the area and stop them from finishing the job. But again, in terms of the kind of scent patterns that were left, it was meant to smell like it was the Snowdancer pack who did it, but it was actually a group of 6 Psy mercenaries who later they find and kill. They also implement a counterattack against the Psy through their technology and effectively like destroy a bunch of these business deals on the stock market that they were trying to do. So at the end of the book, the council kind of takes the decision of like, okay, we're going to stop doing this Psy or trying to escalate this Changeling war. We also find out that they had taken control of the minds of a lot of these hyenas who had done the attack against Snowdancer. So they go and kind of deprogram them. And what also in the course of this, somebody tries to kill Judd and make it smell like it was one of Brenna's brothers, but they realize that's what was happening. So again, they're not sure if that's a part of the size thing. And then finally somebody tries to assassinate Brenna. Her brother takes a bullet for her, and Judd discovers he's able to use his TK cell abilities to essentially like mend his wound, and saves his life. And we come to find out is that one of the snow dancer soldiers, a guy named Dieter, actually sold out Brenna to Enrique in exchange for drugs. And that was why he was trying to kill Brenna, was because he sensed that she was trying to regain some of her memories, and he thought she would remember him. So he was trying to eliminate her. So that's kind of the mystery plot. So by the end of the book, we have Judd and Brenna together. Judd is now a lieutenant in the Snow Dancer pack. We have some scenes with the Dark River Leopards when Sasha and Faith work with Brenna on trying to heal some of her mind, some of her psychic issues. We also learn at the end that Enrique, the reason that Brenna was seeing some of these visions is that Enrique had altered some of her psychic makeup, and actually she would have died if Judd hadn't mated her, found that defect, and helped basically teach her to siphon off some of the pressure points that he'd put into her mind. So we leave with a lot more pieces on the chessboard in terms of the macro plot, because we have Protocol 1, we have the Ghost, we have these new dynamics within the Psi Council because it's the Scots versus Nikita and Caleb, and then the other three are kind of in the mix. We have learned more about a couple of other Psi clans who are going to come back up, or like big Psi families who will come back up throughout the series. We have a new lieutenant in the Snow Dancer pack. There's just a lot of foreshadowing in this book for the rest of the series. So it's not only a very significant book in terms of just a fan favorite, but as you can tell just even from the plot recap, just a lot happens in this book that will continue to be relevant as we move forward with the series. So with that, now we at least have somewhat of a synopsis and we can keep going from here. Okay, and so now we're back. So hopefully everybody remembers everything that happens in this book, which is like a shit ton of plot.
Yeah.
So you said that this is the one that really cemented you being into the series. Is it the plot in this one that hooked you in, or was it like characters? Like, what about this book?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me it was, it was multiple things, but I think the biggest thing for me with this book is I saw how Nalini Singh was using relationships to explore interesting topics and issues in ways that really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the things that I love so much about this book, is that it's about a couple where both people have a history of a lot of trauma that they are healing with and trying to deal with. And she takes a lot of care with developing their relationship, and especially developing the physical side of their relationship, keeping in mind the PTSD and the trauma that they're in the process of healing from. And I just thought that was so beautifully done. And I think that was it, where I was like, okay, like she is doing something in this series where not only is it fun and you have these great characters and interesting overarching political machinations, I like all of that, but the fact that she's able to so thoughtfully use romance as a way of exploring real world relationship dynamics, I think that was the thing that kind of cemented this for me.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me on the reread. It's interesting. It's been a few years, I think, since I've reread this one, but that was for sure one of the things that stood out to me this time, was her using Judd's literal physical response to touch as a way to literalize a metaphor for trauma. And really the same with Brenna, but both of them having their own trauma that has now been in this speculative romance series literalized in a way that forces them to take the physical side of their relationship very slow, that in a way that I think is very purposefully analogous to trauma, either of like kind of sexual abuse type or just like emotional and physical abuse in Judd's case.
Yeah.
But I think that was a really potent and smart metaphor that she really, really pulls off.
Yeah, I agree. And I think especially, I mean, with both of them, I think this is true. But the thing that struck me is near the end, when finally they actually have sex for the first time, Judd is so cautious to make sure that he isn't doing anything that is triggering Brenna. Like the way
Mm-hmm.
that he, checks in with her and prioritizes consent. And I especially think this stands out when you think about when this book was written, because this is an early book in the series. And when this was published, the conversations we were having around issues like consent were not the same. And I just find
For
it
real.
impressive that back then she was doing things with consent, doing things with casual diversity that now we see a lot more of, but I don't know that that existed in the same way, in the early aughts.
Yeah, I think the diversity thing, let's definitely come back to that, because I
Hmm.
just throughout the series, I continue to be impressed with that. But yeah, I think that that's a really great point about this is a book I would now point to as an example of like consent can be very sexy.
Yeah.
Because yeah, when they finally are able to touch,
Hmm.
basically because he flames out and his abilities go offline and he's like, ooh, like
Take advantage of the
we
situation.
got to do this now while I don't, have this response.
Yeah.
Um, it is such, I remember being so struck at the time. And now, many moons later, post Ruby Dixon and Jessa Kane, these scenes don't scandalize me in the same way. But at the time, I remember being like, this is very sexy. And when they
Yeah.
finally get down, it is a very sexy scene that is centered around mutuality and
Hmm.
consent and communication.
Hmm.
Which I think for a 2007 release is
Hmm.
pretty impressive.
Yeah. No, really. And I appreciate that. I think Nalini Singh was clearly doing some groundbreaking work, which is, I mean, good for her to see that. And I think it's interesting that it probably speaks to the fact that the series has continued to have so much resonance and lasting power. People
For
that
real.
were still reading this and talking about it, and she's still putting out books in the world, and it holds up in a way that I don't think a lot of series from this time do.
Yeah, I would agree. I did a reread of, or not a reread, I guess like a finishing read of Kresley Cole's Immortals After Dark
Hmm.
series last year, which started I think around the same time. And I can say that I think the earlier books definitely have aged not as well as the early books inside Changeling have.
Hmm.
At least so far. Next, the next two books in the series, I remember not liking when I first read them for some of their time reasons. So we'll see.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
may not be true of all of them, but at least
No.
these first three, I'm like, I feel like these have actually aged pretty well
Yeah.
in a post Me Too world.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
which I think is impressive.
Yeah. Well, one thing that really struck me this time around, so I don't know, because I know you've reread this, you've read it twice now.
Yeah.
The first time I read this, I was so just like enamored with Judd as a character
Mhm.
that I don't remember loving Brenna the same
Hmm.
way. Like I was so into Judd and just his whole journey. But this time I was really struck by how it's a very equal partnership and I think it's a
Mm.
very balanced relationship.
Mhm.
I don't know. I was just really struck by how strong Brenna really is in a way that
Yeah.
I think the first time I didn't take as seriously.
Mhm.
But this time I was just so I mean, it's weird to say like proud or impressed about a fictional character, but I'm like, she shows such tenacity after this horrible assault, and just
Mhm.
watching her kind of reclaim her identity in a new way really, really struck me this time around of how balanced that dynamic between them was.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what I love so much about this, because I really do love seeing relationships that feel like a true partnership. And it's funny, I was looking back over at my Goodreads review from when I read this for the first time last year, and that was one of the things that I said about it, is that it truly feels like a partnership, that you have, the strength on both sides, and care for each other. And yeah, so I mean, that was something that I think from the very beginning struck me and that I loved. I loved Brenna being this strong heroine who, even though she had been through such a horrible situation and undergone so much trauma, she comes out so strong and figuring out who she is. Well, and especially I think in this book, you really see that arc for her of getting to the point where she's like, okay, I know my brothers have been super protective of me. I am ready for some more independence. I don't need that anymore. I'm ready to take on the world again, even though I've been hurt in the past. And I think one of the things that I really loved too is seeing Judd support her in that journey, because
Yes.
frequently, right, you see men who are kind of like holding women back from doing that and being overly protective. And in this book, it's interesting because her brothers are taking that role, and Judd's the one who's like, no, you need to let her go and you need to let her do what she needs to do. And I thought that was great.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting. I've noticed in these first three books, and then thinking kind of in some of the things that are going to happen, I feel like broken relationships with sisters, or like bad things happening to sisters, is a real theme throughout this series.
That's true.
Um, and I hadn't thought about what you just said, but I think you're 100% right that we do see her brothers taking that sort of more traditional role we see in fiction a lot of times, where the man is angry on the woman's behalf when she's
Mm-hmm.
assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of is centering their own anger rather than what she needs.
Yeah.
So it's refreshing to see Judd, really trying to help her move forward on her own terms rather than purely like centering his own upset about what happened to her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, we won't go totally into this, but I am somebody who's experienced sexual assault. And I think this time I have more awareness of the connection I had with Brenna. And I just, in general, if you're somebody who, I mean, we should be clear. It's not, she is assaulted physically to some degree. It's really more of a mental violation of her. But if that's something that usually bothers you in these books, just be aware of that coming into this one. But also, I do think that this is a particularly good exploration of acknowledging what that does to people, but also showing somebody who is moving through a process of healing in a way that doesn't feel like cheap
Yeah.
or exploitative.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say that I noticed this time around is that when she is talking about what had happened to her, because initially I did kind of read it as primarily a psychological thing, which part of it was, but she does mention in this book that there was also like I don't know how
He uses
descriptive
his,
he
yeah,
well, he there like I think there was the use of like other objects,
yes.
and then forcing her to feel pleasure, basically.
Yeah, and I actually thought that was a really moving scene because I think people who have survived assault, that is one of the things that you kind of, I mean, depending on the nature of the assault, but
Sure.
one of the things that can come up is, well, but it felt good.
Yeah.
And what does that mean that it felt good? And
Yeah.
there's an explicit um, kind of unpacking with Judd where he really walks her through and like helps her process the difference between pleasure because somebody is hurting you
Mhm.
versus actual pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I thought was a really moving scene, actually.
Like as a physical response versus something really wholehearted and real. Yeah, I loved
Exactly.
that. I just think there's so much that's done really well and really carefully in this book, and yeah, I love it. And so when they do finally get together, he's careful. It's like, are you really ready for this? Are you ready for like
Hmm.
whatever the next step is? Knowing what her background is. And I just love that. I think it's beautiful. Like he's not rushing things. He's not focused so much on himself and what he wants out of that moment. He's focused on her and what she needs and how this can be like a mutually satisfying experience.
Yeah, and then I think in turn, once they've kind of passed that initial kind of milestone of having physical intimacy, and she becomes aware of what their physical intimacy does to him on a psychic level,
Hmm.
she then becomes kind of the caretaker saying, no, like you need to go to your your apartment now
Yeah.
because you're hurting yourself, and like I'm not
Yeah.
going to let you hurt yourself for what I want in this moment.
Yeah. It's really beautiful. Like they're caring for each other and making sure that both of them have whatever it is that they need. And I love that. I think this relationship is so beautiful.
I know, it's such a good one. I mean, well, okay, and this raises a question because Judd Lauren is sort of like one of the most beloved heroes in the Changeling fandom.
Yeah.
And it does make me wonder because it's not I don't I mean, you haven't gotten to all of the heroes that you will encounter who
Uh-huh.
are all wonderful.
Mhm.
Um but I wonder what is it about these men that make such good romance heroes? Cuz I think there is something about
Yeah.
this dynamic she sets up with these men who like I'm trying to even process this as because I wrote this down as a question, but it's like there are these men who are um physically inexperienced. Like all of these dudes are virgins because like the don't do that. They don't do those base animal things anymore.
No, right.
Um but they seem so emotionally cut off,
Yeah.
and yet we the readers see that they have like they're these, under the surface, these roiling, tempestuous, passionate men who
Yeah.
like are so contained on the surface, but with the right heroine like come to be able to express that side of themselves. So I
Yeah.
wonder if there's some like kind of wish fulfillment in that setup, because I personally find these heroes like they are my favorites in the series.
Yeah. No, I love them too. I mean, I guess my take on it would be that it's a couple of things. One is that because they are so controlled, like that element of it's this heroine who kind of
Yes.
undoes their control, right?
Yes.
I mean,
This special, it's like my special hoo-ha is the only one that
yes,
can melt your
yes,
icy heart.
exactly, and bring out that passion. And I think there's a sense of power that comes with that, um, and I think that's probably appealing. I also think there is something kind of sexy about passion under control, because even
Mm,
when these women bring out that passion, like it's still controlled, like they're very careful and they're cautious about how they use it. And I think for me, one of the things that's appealing about that is we frequently in society have men painted as these kind of I don't know. And I don't think this is actually how most men are, but I think like sometimes the idea of how men are is they're like driven by their lusts and driven by their passions and more
mm,
animalistic and like can't control themselves. And like this gets into a lot of like rape culture discussion and how that can be, there's a lot of like problematic and toxic masculinity things that can get associated with that. But I think
mhm.
because of that, to me, there's something really appealing about like masculinity that is that is under control, that's not out of control, and where like passion is uh, chosen and like taking into account the heroine. And like not everybody likes the same thing, and this is why I think I talk to some readers who really do love the changeling heroes more, and so like it
Mm,
depends
yeah.
somewhat on what you like. But for me, I find that very appealing. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're exactly right that in some ways the changeling, it's like the and the changeling heroes represent two kind of shadings of the traditional romance hero. So traditionally, part of what like I was kind of joking about, part of what's special about a romance heroine is that she is the only one who can bring out like the emotional side of a hero.
Right.
That's definitely like kind of a trope in the genre. But then likewise with the changeling heroes, another big trope is the hero introducing the heroine to her sensual side.
Mm.
So it's almost like kind of two extremes of romance hero archetypes. So maybe it just says something about us that we tend to like one more than the. I mean, they're both great, but like
Yeah, no, but
there is just something that speaks to me on a primal level about these men where I'm just like,
yeah.
oh, like,
Yeah.
and you know what you're saying about toxic masculinity. I think it's the same part of me that literally I always cry on shows where I see men like talking emotionally about their dads.
Yeah.
It just kills me because I'm like, oh, you're not allowed to have emotions in the way
Yeah.
that you were meant to have them, and it just
Yeah.
breaks my little heart.
Well, and I mean, that's part of this, the whole arc of these sci heroes also is them finally being able to express their emotions. And also, like,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times they're really broken, like especially the ones who've
Yes.
if they've been arrows like Judd, they've been through horrific things, they've been traumatized, they've been broken, and like part of their journey with the heroine is like finding healing from that, and like someone who can help bring them back together. And like I think that's and it's not just the heroine, but like the process of building that relationship. And I don't know, I love it.
I do too. Have you read I know that Walker's story is a little bit in Kiss of Snow, but have you read his novella that he gets with Laura?
I have not, no.
You would love it. You should seek it out.
Okay.
It's very satisfying on those levels.
Okay.
Because he was like kind of a cinnamon roll stuck in a Psy body
Oh,
because he loves kids, and
yeah.
it's very sweet. So anyway, you
I
have
love it.
generally the
Okay.
novellas of this series are fantastic and worth reading.
Yeah,
So
eventually, I like, there are so many just books I've been trying to catch up on
I
that,
know.
but yeah, I would like to read some of the
Circle back on
novellas.
those. Now, okay, shifting a little bit to some of the macro stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay, Protocol 1 in this hive mind situation. I
Yes.
cannot figure out. I'm a little, because I don't really remember. I'm going to be honest. I'd kind of forgotten that this was a big part of the early part of the series. I was trying to think when I was rereading it this time. Why would the council even really want a hive mind? Like, I just feel like that would introduce a lot of logistical problems long term for you in terms of cultivating who are the worker bees and who gets to be in the queen bee
Yeah.
status of the hive mind.
Well, and I think this is part of why you see the council be split on it, that not every council member is in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for the people who are in favor of it, it allows you to build a very committed army.
Mm-hmm.
It allows you to have more control over the behavior of the Psy. And I think especially after everything that went down in book one, there's probably, like, my sense has been that there's some level of concern about, like, okay, like, are there people getting too out of control? What can we do to
Mm.
control the narrative, to control Psy behavior? And I think there's some concern about, like, is this going to leak and lead to revolution, and how can we kind of tamp down on that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right now that you say that. I think in the last book what I was processing is the Psy are really not emotionless the way that they talk about being emotionless, because
No.
they are still greedy and ambitious
Hmm.
and, I guess loyal. Like, actually, no, I take that back. Like, they do
Hmm.
tend to be pretty loyal.
Yeah.
Um, but it's like they want to take it to the next. I don't know. I just think, I guess if I were on the Psy Council, I would be thinking about, I don't see how this long term is going to work.
Yeah.
Then again, I guess they probably weren't sure that silence would work when it first got introduced. So
Yeah. Well,
who
it's hard,
knows?
right? Because when your propaganda is idolizing the lack of emotion, you could imagine that then achieving perfection would look like minimizing even the emotion that's left over after silence.
Mm, yeah, well, which plays into last time. I don't know if you may not have heard my last episode, but
Not
my
yet.
big like rebel. Yeah, how dare you not follow
Sorry.
everything I put out? But my big revelation was that I actually read this book when I was deconstructing out of fundamentalist evangelicalism. Like, that
Mm,
was when I first read this series,
hmm.
and I think the entire signet, like a very powerful or like present reading for it in the text, is a metaphor for extreme religion.
Mm,
And what you were just saying about, like, once you have like one ideal that's a group ideal,
hmm.
going to an extreme with it becomes even more kind of socially, like a social currency among the in group,
Hmm.
which I think very much could play into a reading of the Signet, or like silence at least, as a version of like religious extremism.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, which is interesting too, because then you start getting, splinter sects on some level, with
Hmm.
different levels of extremism. And Yeah, I mean, as somebody who like probably was a little further along in that journey away from fundamentalism, which we've talked about that I have a similar background. Um, it- yeah, I can definitely see that. And it's interesting because you start seeing more sort of subgroups and people who some of whom want to become more sort of liberal in their values and others who want to tamp down and become even more conservative and controlling. And I think you see similar things happen in religious structures and religious organizations, especially when like a big shakeup happens. I mean, you could possibly compare it to some of these scandals that come out about big religious leaders, and then what happens in the wake of that. You have some people who are sort of doubling down, and then
Mm-hmm.
others who are wanting to break away and be like, okay, like clearly we've missed it. Something's wrong, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And I think within the book this time, because I guess I was more attuned to that, the little opening prologue where it's describing how silence first came to be with that group called Mercury and how they were described as being like religious zealots,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
So I think I guess I just hadn't picked that up my first time reading through the series, but I think even in the text, that's a parallel we're invited to make.
I was going to say, you even think about like when she was writing this, a very pertinent thing in the kind of international conversation was
Mm.
religious terrorism with like Islamic
Oh,
terrorists.
you're totally right. Yeah.
And so, it to me it reads like that was probably some of what she was thinking about in this text, and especially as you get into other parts of the series and you do have kind of terrorist subgroups. I'm sure that was part of the inspiration.
Yeah, I had not thought about that, but I would bet you are 100% correct there.
Mm,
Because that was definitely a part of sort of the zeitgeist in the post 9/11 kind of
hmm.
post Iraq war era.
Yeah.
Um, and then, I mean, I think also something I hadn't picked up the first time I was reading through the series, but Father Perez, who we're introduced to in this book,
Mm,
um, he is a part of a version of Catholicism that seems to have had like a second Reformation.
yeah.
Like I had totally missed that the first time, but it references like this new version of the Bible, I guess they're using, and
Hmm.
so yeah. Anyway, all that to say, I just this time I guess I'm just more attuned to those references, but it does seem like the text is inviting us to kind of think of silence and kind of the signet in general as some version of religious extremism.
Yeah. Well, which is interesting too, because you also think about like during this time period where fundamentalist evangelical culture was really about purity and about abstinence and about like suppressing the passions of the flesh. And so I mean like there's a lot of parallels you can draw there between like
Yeah,
silence and it's I mean there's some of that now, but I think especially back then, I mean
like Promise Keepers
yeah,
and
and
the
and
purity pledges
purity
and
pledges, all of that was happening then, and it's interesting to think about this stuff coming out of that time period.
for sure. Yeah, now you're making me want to go do like a little archaeology on what all was going
It
on in
would be
that time
very
because
interesting, yeah.
yeah, well, I think that's definitely a great kind of layering in there.
Mhm.
Do you have anything that you think doesn't work well in this book?
It's my favorite book.
I know. Because I only
Um,
could really come up with one thing that I thought was a legitimate critique.
yeah, I don't I like nothing really stood out to me, but I would be interested to hear your take.
The only thing that struck me at the beginning of this was that I do think that there is a lot of telling rather than showing in terms of the dynamic between Judd and Brenna.
Hmm.
Like you're dropped in, and I think as the book goes along, there's enough sort of like references to things that have been happening between them up prior to the book. Probably, I guess, concurrent with Visions of Heat, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, but it does imply a level of like kind of closeness or intimacy between them that I didn't know was totally earned at the beginning. I mean, I bought it by the end for sure, but that was the only thing that struck me as like a little
Hmm.
off in terms of some of the there was a lot of sort of info dumping in the beginning of it, I felt like.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it might be she's doing so much in this series. And I think
Yeah.
starting in these books, she then does begin to do the slow build of intimacy between characters. So that by the time you get to, like, say, book 10,
Hmm.
like, like you're very ready for what's going to happen with those couples. So yeah, like I can see that. And I imagine that part of it might just be kind of that it's early in the series and she hasn't had the time to build all of that backstory in. But
Yeah, and it is our first book with the wolves. Like both of
yeah,
the first two were with the leopards, so we
right.
didn't, to be fair, we didn't have as much time to see that as we would have if we'd been following that pack. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, well, you say foreshadowing. I made like a little list of things. I was like, okay, all three books we've seen Hawk and Sienna getting into it.
Yep.
We see Silver as Caleb's assistant, who actually you've not read Silver's book yet.
No. I also still haven't read like I keep waiting for Kit's book too.
Oh yeah, yeah, you got some good stuff
Yeah,
coming.
I'm looking forward to it.
We've got, let's see what else. We get that Ashaya Elaine is the head scientist of Protocol
Right?
1.
Yep. Hmm.
We get Zizen, who I don't know if you've seen yet.
Maybe. I yeah.
He's the biological father of Aisha's son in the Zen
Oh.
family.
Yeah, I have not. No, not really.
Yeah, so he's gonna come back
Well,
up. And
interesting.
then
Okay.
uh Faith foresees that the ghost is going to be important to the Dark River Pack one day.
Yep.
And I was like, oh my gosh, she calls it so
I know.
early.
I know. There's so much foreshadowing in this one. I love it. Well, and then the other thing I love is seeing um see Sasha and Lucas have a dynamic later on as well, like seeing them on page as they're interacting
Mhm.
further into their relationship, which continues to be one of my favorite things about this series is revisiting these characters and seeing how they're growing and developing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that for the most part, my I'll put a caveat on this. For
Hmm.
the most part, I think that Nalini Singh does a really nice job of continuing to give you glimpses of characters you've known and loved from previous books
Hmm.
without it feeling overly like fan service, which I
Hmm.
think can happen sometimes in long running series. The only caveat I would say is that there is a book, I guess it's book 15, where kind of quote unquote season one of the series wraps up and the second season ramps up.
Hmm.
And in that book, there is a lot of just hanging out with couples, which as a fan I enjoy, but I think as a book it kind of suffers for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. I do. I
Yeah.
always love seeing like we get some good Faith and Bond moments in this. We get
Hmm.
some good Sasha Lucas. So
Hmm.
yeah, we get to check in with our
Yeah.
favorite couples.
One thing that I had actually forgotten until rereading it is how antagonistic Sasha's mom is in this book.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that too. Nikita's
Hmm.
like a stone cold bitch.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which becomes more interesting. Like Nikita, I think is one of the most interesting characters in
She's
in the
fascinating.
whole series because
Yeah.
she's so politically shrewd and like calculating.
Hmm.
But as the series goes on, like she definitely gets complicated
Yes.
beyond just kind of what we see of her in these first books.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is interesting. So I had kind of forgotten about that um, until
Yeah,
rereading. Hmm.
this I've been so impressed with these first three books, just seeing how many kind of like she calls a lot of shots that she pays
Yeah.
off like 10 or 12 books later.
Yeah. It's impressive.
It's really impressive. I don't know if she's just that good of a plotter or if she just goes back and reads what she already has on page and then incorporates it. Like,
You will have to ask her that.
I will have to ask her that. Preview of coming attractions. But yeah, that I think she's either a very good reader of her own work or
Hmm.
she's like got some sort of red yarn
Yeah.
conspiracy board up somewhere
I would
keeping
I
track
would
of
I
all
would
these
love
things.
to know that if she has like some giant plan. I think that would be
I
cool.
I mean, I trust her because
Yeah.
the first season is very satisfying as a macro plot. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's also just so many details, and I won't get into it because we're still early on, but later on, you get so many interesting details dropped about the world and the past of this world because it's like it's like a parallel to our world where
Yeah.
things were different in like the 70s and 80s. And like, I just find those moments so interesting when we get like little glimpses at the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we get yeah, the lore in this world is really rich.
Yeah.
And it is interesting because it is so recognizably our world.
Yeah.
But she also has all of these other like alternative timeline things happening that are just really they feel very believable. Like I
Yeah.
think that's part of what's impressive about it is it feels all of it feels very plausible to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, all of this is why I love it so much, and I think, I don't think the series is really appreciated for how great it is as a sci-fi series. Like
Yes.
people talk a lot about like, oh, it's like steamy romance, and I don't think they really give enough credit to the level of detailed world building that she's doing, and the all of the things that she's doing in this are so sophisticated on some
Mhm.
level, and I don't think people really talk about the series that way very often.
Yeah, I completely agree because I would put this up against any number of I would call it urban fantasy. This is sci-fi, but I feel like urban sci-fi is not something we talk about.
No, yeah,
So,
it's like a
but so
weird
it's like
genre
yeah,
blend.
it's like it's urban fantasy vibes, but it is not really fantasy. It really
Mhm.
is sci-fi.
Yeah.
And I would put this up against pretty much any of the major urban fantasy series and say that this is as if not more interesting in terms of its world building.
Yeah.
Um, just in terms of the use of technology, I think I forgot in this book that Brenna is developing like a way to teleport. I'd totally forgotten that that was a thing.
Yeah, well, and
She
she's like a computer programmer, like,
Mhm.
she's, like, so badass, I love
She
it.
is. I love Brenna. I had such a deeper appreciation for her this time around. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's like advanced medical technology.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting actual kind of world setup.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't think it gets the credit that it deserves
Yeah,
on
for
that
sure.
front.
No.
Yeah. I mean, there's also a lot of smut in it. So I get
I
it.
mean,
But,
there is, but, like
but you can have smut and,
yeah.
teleportation in the
I
same
mean, why not?
world. Why not? Yeah.
Well, and speaking of the smut, one thing that I think is really kind of fun and novel that we get for the first time in this book is you know, psychic sex.
Uh yeah, we get well, we should so Judd, I mentioned this in the recap. Judd is a telekinetic
Yeah.
and he can move things with his mind and
And
that
make
includes
you feel his hands where they are not physically.
yeah. He can make your lady bits uh feel very specific things
Yeah.
with the nerve endings, and I salute Nalini Singh's bravery for exploring the implications of that.
I love it. I think it's great.
They're very spicy
They
scenes by the
are.
time we get
Yeah.
there.
No, they for sure are. It's great.
Yeah, I mean that's part of why Jed is so beloved
Mhm.
in the fandom. Who doesn't want somebody who can telekinetically,
Yeah.
hit that special place and
Hey,
make you fall apart?
I mean, why not? Well, and this is not the last time that we see somebody who can do this. Like
Oh,
TKs
yeah,
have this ability, and
they
it's
are
fun.
blessed.
Mhm.
Yeah, they are blessed among men, I think.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, before we get into ratings, do you have any other shout outs or things that you noticed you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, I think that we pretty much covered most of it. That's a lot of what I love about this, and like I will say too, it's it's interesting because Judd is continues to have a dark side to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe not as much as with some future psi heroes that we get, but he continues to do some more intense dark things and be involved in uh, dangerous political things. I don't want to say too much about
Yeah,
it.
he's best buds with the
With the
ghost.
ghost,
So
yeah.
that means that he gets into some shit
He
still.
does, yeah. And I think it's interesting because Brenna, I guess I like the fact too that both of them continue to be active in different ways and do dangerous things even after they're together, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes
Hmm.
in stories like this, what you see is the hero and heroine, get together under dangerous circumstances and then kind of settle down in like a quiet domestic life. And
Mm.
I appreciate the fact that this doesn't do that. Like, it doesn't make marriage and family boring, or like,
Mm.
if that makes,
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, well, that's something I've always liked about the In Death series is that it's like a 52 book series.
Mhm.
The main couple gets married in the third book. They have, 49 books of adventure and counting
I love it.
afterwards. So, yeah, I totally agree that we don't always see kind of that celebration of like married life doesn't equal like the end in
Yeah.
romance. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of just the beginning.
Yeah.
And actually bringing that up, because one thing I was wanting to mention was I think you're exactly right about like the darkness within him
Mm.
still. And that's like a metaphor. So the book is called Caressed by Ice, but
Mhm.
like I was very struck by how often in this book there's a reference to either light or dark or hot or cold.
Mm.
And how Brenna is specifically at many points she talks about like the snow as being purifying
Hmm.
or the cold as being refreshing.
Hmm.
And I think part of what like is being the metaphor or like the motif in this is that just because you have a dark side to you or a dark past, I think kind of like problematizing the equivocation of coldness to being bad,
Yeah.
which I thought was just like an interesting kind of use of that imagery that we don't always see in a romance.
Yeah.
The only other things that I wanted to mention, one is I think we see a building on um, one of the things the Psy needing to learn is how to be more unified.
Mm.
Kind of one of the strengths of the Psy is that they are so unified, but the changelings, sorry, I may have said that backwards, but the changelings need to learn to come together more,
Yeah.
because part of what has allowed these different packs to be kind of pitted against each other is that they are so territorial and they have had such a hard time kind of getting along as a unit,
Yeah.
and the Psy have used that against them. So I think this is we see even before the first book, Snow Dancer and Dark River have kind of taken a step to be more unified, but this is sort of a continuation of we have to go further if we
Yeah.
want to be able to stand up to the Psy.
Yeah, it's interesting because that makes me think of too one other thing that you see in this book is, and I think is a continued theme, is the Psy are always underestimating the changelings. They have this
Yes.
idea of them as being animalistic and feral and uneducated, and I think you really see here that is not true. They're smart and can be talented. Some of them are good with computer programming and hacking, and I think it's interesting because especially in this book, some of the things that the Psy try to do to take them down are just done really sloppily.
Yeah.
And
It's like, come on, guys. Like, if you're going to have a dastardly plot, at least put your back into it.
right, yeah. But it's clear that they underestimate the capabilities of the changelings. And you see going forward in the series, they slowly start to realize, oh, we need to take this more seriously than we thought we did. But especially in this book, they're like, they don't do a great job.
Yeah, they definitely get sloppy. And I mean, every time, yeah, the last three books, or at least the last book in this one, we see no, all three, that we see the changelings really slapping back at the Psy. Like
Yeah.
in the first one, they literally send Enrique's body parts to the different
Oh,
counselors.
yeah.
They
That was,
chop
that was
him
a
up,
lot.
and yeah, it was intense. I'd forgotten that was what happens.
Yeah.
And then in the last book, Vaughn like kills all of these Psy assassins who come after Faith and like put them on Nikita's doorstep. And then in this one, they kill all the assassins who came for the Deer Clan,
Right.
and then they like take down their business.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at the end of this third one, they officially give up their vendetta against the changelings because they're like, this is not,
Yeah.
this
I
is not
mean,
working out.
well, it's interesting, right? That like the thing that finally does it is coming after their money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and throughout this one, it keeps getting referenced, like, all of these, side business people are pissed that they
Yeah.
lost Faith Nightstar, and like,
Yep.
yeah. So there was that. I did want to mention that I did see some more parallels in this one to the In Death series. The way that Jax and Rush get talked about as like futuristic drugs is very similar to how drugs in the In Death series are described.
Interesting.
And then she also uses the phrase cap of hair, which is such a Nora Roberts description. Like every heroine in Nora Roberts books always have a cap of hair. So anyway, I saw some, like, you definitely read Nora Roberts, which I love. And then also, the last thing I want to just randomly throw out is I think structurally this is the most like a traditional romantic suspense book of any of the ones we've reread so far. Because you've read, well, actually, I know you've read The Obsession from Nora Roberts, because you know I love that one. And in those kinds of romantic suspense books, often you have a POV of the anonymous bad guy coming in, and we definitely got that in this one. So this really did feel like, in addition to reading like a speculative romance and a contemporary romance in some places, it also read like a romantic suspense. So
something for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a jack of all trades when it comes to subgenre.
Yes.
So, okay, well then maybe we'll just move into ratings.
Sounds good.
So I do 4 different rating types, and then we give our overall. So the first one is cozy community vibes, which I always do it out of something relevant to the book. So for instance, I would give this 8 out of 10 blood bonding oaths for cozy community vibes, because I feel like we got a lot of really good time with the Snow Dancer pack, and got to see a lot more of them than we have in the last 2 books.
Yeah, so I knew you did that, so I did prepare some things.
Oh, good.
So I would give this 7 out of 10 TK children playing ball.
Oh, yeah, that was really moving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brenna and Judd's niece have a very sweet scene where she realizes she's been afraid of TKs for no reason. It's very sweet.
Yeah.
What would you give for heat level?
So I gave it 6 psychic orgasms.
Nice. Okay, I actually gave it 8 out of 10 destroyed pieces of furniture.
Interesting. Oh yeah, the destroyed furniture. I like that. Yeah, I guess what it is like, I'm thinking compared to some later books where things get steamy very quickly, I felt like this was more of a slow burn. And so it is very steamy, but not like right out the gate.
Yeah, I think the reason I rate it highly is because, again, this was early in my romance reading journey, and that, like, those scenes where he's like breaking furniture, like, were seared in my mind. So to me,
that's fair. They are good. They are good scenes. I guess it depends on his like quantity versus quality.
Quality, yeah. They left a mark on my internal imaginative landscape in a way that others did not. So.
That's fair.
What did you give for political machinations?
So I gave this one 6 scheming council members. I feel like this one has a good bit of the political machinations going on, but again, to me at least, like, it didn't read as prominently as some of the other books where like there was a lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because again, it's been a while since I've done a reread. So to me, this is just me like kind of coming at it a little fresher. Like, I don't remember what happens in the next books as recently.
Yeah.
So I actually gave this 10 out of 10 instigated Changeling Wars.
Interesting.
Because there's so much foreshadowing and so much like gerrymander. Like, I feel like the macro plot in this one is much more prominent than the last 2. Like, the last 2 had a lot of sort of setting the chessboard.
Yeah.
And I felt like this was the first one where I saw a lot of the pieces getting moved.
Yeah.
See,
it's interesting because for me, I'm like reading on through the series, and this is the first one that I've reread. So going back from where I was, it feels like a little bit less politically driven than some of the other books. So it's interesting.
It'll be interesting because so I remember the books about like 9 through 14 pretty well.
Yeah.
But we're coming up on a spate of them. Like, I remember Branded by Fire, but roughly 4 through 8, I don't remember as much, because for the most part, they're not my favorites in the series.
Yeah.
So I may just be skewed in my remembering.
Well,
We'll find
see.
out
We'll
as we
see.
go. Yeah. What did you do for angst?
I gave it 8 longing gazes.
Yeah. I gave it 7 out of 10 brain bleeds for your one true love.
That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of feelings
There
in this one, I feel like.
There's a lot. And there's a lot of like wanting to be together and you can't. Well, because, like Judd literally cannot touch her too much or he will
Mhm.
psychically explode.
Or his brain will bleed.
I know.
Yeah. Well, and
it.
I mean, it kind of harkens back. So in Slave to Sensation, there's so much angst in that one because you don't know how Sasha's going to get out.
Yeah.
Like that's so much the tension. And this one doesn't have quite that same level of urgency,
Mm.
but it does have the new mystery of like, how can somebody who needs silence be able to have an emotional relationship?
Yeah.
And you don't know how they're going to solve that kind of riddle. So it does create a lot of tension, I think.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So overall, what would you rate this?
Easily 5 stars. This
Yes.
is like, the last year when I read it, it was one of my favorite books of the year. I love this one.
Yeah, I also give this 5 stars.
Yeah.
Like this is one of my all-time favorite books, I would say, because it's just it's an iconic book of speculative romantic fiction.
It is.
It's iconic for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, it's been so much fun to dive in with you on this book.
This was fun.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a minute to rate and review the show, as well as share it with your fellow speculative romance-loving friends. If you want to hear more from me, you can follow me at Books Like Whoa on YouTube, Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. Bethany, where can people find you?
I am Beautifully Bookish Bethany on Instagram and YouTube. Bookish_Bethany on Twitter. And you can also find me at Chapter 3 Podcast talking about romance, science fiction, and fantasy.
So if you want more podcasting goodness, go check that out. Well, thanks so much to Bethany for joining us.
Yeah.
And thank you guys for listening. We will be back to talk about a book that I don't remember as fondly from my first read next time, which is Mine to Possess. But it is Clay's book, so at least we're back with the leopards. So that's good at least. So tune in next time to see how that goes, and I hope you guys are having a great day. Bye!